If you'll look in Matthew chapter 14, I mentioned earlier, we're going to look at Jesus' compassion. And actually, I'm going to make the title I've already written on my paper, Miracles of Compassion. We all, at least I do, I get excited when I see that word miracle. I don't want to miss out on one. I like to hear about them. I like to read about them. I like to hear testimonies especially and just get as much firsthand information. And the more I can learn from Scripture on a miracle, especially if it becomes qualified to receive one, I want to get in on it. Well, this is called Miracles of Compassion. Now, right away, I've already mentioned what compassion meant with these younger people down here, but let me give you a dictionary definition while you're looking for Matthew 14, if you're not already there. This is according to the American Heritage Dictionary. Number one definition, deep awareness of the suffering of another, accompanied by the wish to relieve it. And they offer a synonym called pity. Okay? Number two definition, literally suffering with another. A sensation of sorrow excited by the distress or misfortunes of another. And I know all the wives are thankful that all the husbands are just the epitome of compassion, right? All right? Most husbands could use a little more compassion. Wives tend to be a little more compassionate than husbands. But then you've got some people that seem to have an extra spiritual gift of compassion. They're able to just hurt with somebody, and it just energizes them to find somebody that with a need that they can just listen to and soak it in sit there for hours hearing a sob story. I'm not like that. I'm not put together that way. I should be, and I'm getting better. I've made progress, but I'm a long way from being as good as a lot of people, and will probably never arrive. Now, that was American Heritage Dictionary. Merriam-Webster puts it this way, kind of similar language. Sympathetic consciousness. Compassion. What's compassion? Sympathetic consciousness of others' distress together with a desire to alleviate it. Now, these definitions out of both these dictionaries fit what I found for the Greek word, which we'll get into a little later, the Greek word from which we get our English translation, compassion. Jesus was a person of compassion. We're going to look today at miracles of compassion. Jesus sometimes healed out of request. Sometimes he healed based on some people's faith, but then sometimes he healed and did miracles. I say healing, he did other miracles. He did miracles of compassion, out of compassion for people. We're going to read about one this morning out of Matthew chapter 14. Let's see. Let's start at verse 13. Let me give you an introduction here besides what I've already given. Remember we talked about John the Baptist the last couple of Sundays? Well, at this point, Jesus has just gotten word that John the Baptist had his head cut off. He was killed by Herod. You can read about it in those 12 verses prior to. But look what happens when Jesus hears about it in verse 13, Matthew 14. When Jesus heard about it, he withdrew from there by a boat to a remote place to be alone. He just wanted to get alone. I think he was hurting inside because of John the Baptist. After all, he was a relative, but Jesus loved everybody, right? Then the next thing it says is, when the crowds heard this, that he departed and went along, other gospel and Mark, we'll find that what happened was he got in a boat and traveled to another spot, and they saw him evidently going by the seashore and thought, don't know where he's going, but we're going to try to get back to where he was again. So they followed him on foot from the towns. As he stepped ashore, verse 14, he saw a huge crowd, felt compassion for them, and healed their sick. That means nobody was really saying, Jesus, I want my hearing back. I want my vision back. I want this colon cancer healed. I want all that. he just felt compassion on them and he healed them, it says. But look what happens also in verse 15. When evening came, the disciples approached him and said, with these people still being around, still hanging out all day long with him, "This place is a wilderness, and it's already late. Send the crowds away so they can go into the villages and buy food for themselves." To which Jesus responds, "They don't need to go away." Jesus told them, "You give them things to eat." "But we only have 5 loaves and 2 fish here," they said to him. "Bring them here to me," he said. Then he commanded the crowds to sit down on the grass. He took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up into heaven, he blessed them. He broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. Everyone ate and was filled. They picked up 12 baskets full of leftover pieces. Now those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. That was a big crowd. I got to thinking about that. I thought, I don't think I've ever been, and if you could count in here today, I think you'd see it's true. There's more women, more females in here today than there are men, I bet, okay? Somebody can figure that out. I might be wrong. But most church services I've been a part of, it's been more women. In the school classes I've taught, it's been more girls than boys. There's just a greater population, it seems, most of the time. So all that to say, if there's 5,000 men, I don't know how many of them married. There's probably, several thousand, wives, but then children. So I'm thinking, there's got to be at least 10,000 people here. Wouldn't you think? Around 10,000? Well, he fed them, and he did it with what they had, and then he multiplied it. And according to, I think it's Mark mentions this, there was a lad with these 5 pieces of bread and these 2 fish. And I got to thinking, my mind kind of gets out there. I wonder what kind of, was it fried fish he brought? It was probably, then I got thinking, well, food preservation, it was probably salt smoked mullet. And so, just when Jesus broke them, guess what? Everybody had salt smoked mullet or whatever prepared way it was, just instantaneous. If it was fried fish, you ever had fried fish, never got into grease? Happened that day. Whatever it was, it never went through that preparation process, and there was enough to feed about 10,000 people. Started with 5 pieces of bread and 2 fish, and when they got through picking up all the leftovers, there was 12 baskets full. Now that's a miracle by Jesus, but he did it because of his compassion. Well, you remember he had this crowd that records 5,000 men, states 5,000 men, besides women and children. And then there was another day he fed a few thousand more. And the next chapter, look at it with me. Next chapter, look at verse 32 of chapter 15, Matthew 15:32. Now Jesus summoned his disciples and said, "I have compassion on the crowd, because they've already stayed with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. I don't want to send them away hungry, otherwise they might collapse on the way." And skip down, they ask him, disciples wondering, what in the world are we going to do? We ain't got enough, And then look at verse 34. "How many loaves do you have?" Jesus asked them. 7. And they said, "And a few small fish." After commanding the crowd to sit down on the ground, he took the 7 loaves and the fish, he gave thanks, broke them, and kept on giving them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. They all ate and were all filled. Then they collected the leftover pieces, 7 large baskets full. Now those who ate were 4,000 men, besides women and children. So first he feeds 5,000 besides women and children. Now he feeds 4,000 in the very next chapter. Miracles of compassion. Very clear. We just read it. Verse 32 of Matthew 15, I have compassion on the crowd. I don't want to send them away hungry. So he ends up performing another miracle. So we see examples of compassion, first of all, with crowds. But there are also miracles of compassion recorded in Scripture of others, Jesus helping others. The first one, I guess, would be Matthew 9, 35 and 36. He was teaching and preaching and healing in the villages, it said. And this was after it had made reference to Jesus. When he saw the crowds, he felt compassion for them. So out of compassion, he was teaching, preaching, and healing in the villages. There's more miracles. And then in Matthew chapter 20, 34, there's two blind men that come up, or are there on the scene. And it says, moved with compassion, Jesus touched their eyes, and immediately they regained their sight and followed him. Mark 1:41, this leper comes up, moved with compassion, Jesus stretched out his hand and healed him. Luke chapter 7, there was this funeral going on. This dead man had been carried out. They were carrying him out. And it says he was the only son of his mother, and she's a widow. And Jesus saw this going on. I guess it must have been some kind of a stretcher what he was covered up with, probably, instead of one of those pine boxes we see in the cowboy movies. Anybody seen those before? Anyway, so Jesus sees this woman. He has compassion on her. He was moved with compassion. He felt compassion, Luke 7, verse 13, and said to her, do not weep. And in verse 14, he came up and touched the coffin, and the bearers came to a halt. And he said, young man, I say to you, arise. The dead man sat up and began to speak. And Jesus gave him back to his mother. He did that not based on a request, not based on anybody's faith. He did it based on his compassion. Miracles of compassion. Jesus perform miracles out of compassion. The Greek word for compassion, I hope I pronounced this right, splagchnitzo, or form of the word. It means to have compassion or pity, just like we said. But I looked this word up. I wanted to see where this word is used in Scripture, like I often do, more than just an English dictionary or even more than the Greek dictionaries. I want to find every reference of those words in Scripture so I can see for myself what it means in Scripture and what I can learn from it in Scripture. I discovered this word only appears, or a variation of it, only appears 12 times in the whole New Testament. And it's only used in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It's not used, I think, one time in Acts. It's not used in the epistles, just in the Gospels and Acts of the New Testament. It's always used in the Gospels, and most often it's used out of those 12 times in reference to Jesus. And it's safe to say, every time compassion is seen in a person in the New Testament, it always involves or leads to an action of the person with compassion for the one they're having compassion for. I mentioned Jesus, it's used with him more than anybody else, but there are only two more examples of people it's used with. The Good Samaritan, remember him? He had compassion on the fellow he found beside the road, bandaged him up, carried him somewhere and said, look, take care of him and I'll pay you for all your expenses and trouble when I get back. Compassion. And then the prodigal son's father, when he saw that son coming, that father, felt compassion for him, fell on his neck, kissed him, and said, kill the fatted calf. Remember all that story? Compassion. 2 times with other people, but every other time it's used with Jesus. Every time the word of compassion, that Greek word, is used, in association with Jesus, he takes action in providing help to the persons he sees having compassion for, just like that prodigal son's father, just like that Samaritan, they took action. But the only difference with Jesus is every time he's seen as having compassion for somebody, he also performs a miracle every time. Every time. We're just about finished. This is going to be a short lesson today. Y'all mind getting out a little early? Important facts about Jesus and his compassion. Some of this is going to be a little repetition. Every time Jesus had compassion on someone in the Bible, he performed a miracle for them. Second thing, in Scripture, I didn't get this till last night or yesterday, the day before. In Scripture, it appears that Jesus performs thousands more miracles due to his compassion than he does for any other reason. Look at it. Look at these stories we just shared. About 10,000 each time. There's about 20,000. There's other people mentioned. In fact, if you look at the number of recorded miracles in the New Testament, it's not just as many as I thought there were. Matthew's gospel only shows 7 miracles recorded by Jesus. Mark, 22. Luke, 23. And a lot of these are, what you see in Mark, you're going to see again in Luke a lot of times. But the Gospel of John, only 7. Most of these listed miracles were with individuals. Sometimes it was 2 or 3 people at a time. But numbered among those who were, I looked and I tried to count up miracles of Jesus, and I bet you, if there's more than 20 miracles of Jesus for people in the Bible, I mean all the miracles, I'd be surprised. If I looked and I tried to count them, 20, no more than 20, probably 15 or less. But the point again is, Jesus performed thousands more miracles out of compassion than he did for faith or request or any other reason. Anybody find that interesting besides me? All right? That was encouraging to me. And important facts about the crowd Jesus had compassion on out of these 2 stories in Matthew 14 and 15 with feeding all these thousands of people. Here's the first thing. What made them different than any other crowd? Well, they found Jesus. That's the first thing. They found Jesus. They knew he was going ahead, and they found him in that lonely place. That first group did in Matthew chapter 14. And then if you look further, it found Jesus. They went to where Jesus was, Matthew 14:13. Also, same thing with the 4,000 in Matthew 15:29-30. They went to where Jesus was. They found him. They obviously wanted to be with Jesus. That's the difference in this crowd and other crowds, okay? This crowd that he had compassion on, they found Jesus. They wanted to be with Jesus. The overriding point here is they found Jesus. The second thing we learned from there is they listened to Jesus. He was teaching them during this time. They stayed with him all day long. Mark 6:34 very explicitly says he had compassion on them. Then he began to teach them many things during this feeding of these thousands. So they had been with him for a while, listening to his teaching. And then the third thing about this crowd that I think is significant, that he had compassion on and performed these miracles, of the miracle of feeding them, they obeyed Jesus. Matthew 14:19. He commanded the crowd to sit down on the grass. Not he asked them to, he commanded them to. And in Matthew 15, the same thing. It says he commanded them to sit down in groups of 50. And they obeyed him. And then the result, Matthew 15:20, everyone ate and was filled. Everyone who did these 3 things received a miracle. Everyone that found Jesus, everybody that listened to Jesus' teachings, everybody that obeyed Jesus, these were the ones Jesus had compassion on, and provided a miracle for her. That was encouraging to me as I read that, because sometimes I think I just don't have enough faith to receive what I want from God. Listen, maybe I can't seem to get up enough faith to get me a miracle that I need, but maybe I can get one out of compassion, like these people did. Nobody requested food. We don't see anybody asking for food in their stories. They just happened to be a part of a crowd that Jesus had compassion on, and those who were doing the three things I just listed: finding Jesus, listening to Jesus, obeying Jesus. These were the ones that got to experience a miracle. That made it different from them than a crowd downtown at Walmart or wherever else. So, maybe you're not a person with the greatest faith, but I believe Jesus has compassion. I believe, even though it didn't say that in Scripture, it says, "For God so loved the world, He gave His only begotten Son." He gave Jesus, and it goes on. We know Jesus is the epitome of love. And without love, you can't have compassion. So I feel like He has compassion on everybody. And even the crowds that weren't with Him, I think He had compassion on. But I can't get away from those three things. And I feel like God would have me tell you today, listen, if you need something from Jesus, if you need something from Him, be a part of that crowd that's finding Him, that crowd that's listening to His teachings. Now today, we listen to His teachings through His written word. Everything He said to everybody that we need to hear is right here. And obey Him. Be a person that obeys Jesus. Now, I can't promise you that He's going to give you the miracle that you want to have. But I will promise you, based on Scripture, that if you'll come to Him, Matthew 11:28, let me just read you what He said rather than what I say. He said, Matthew 11:28, "Come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you" what? Rest. I'll give you rest. "Take my yoke upon you and learn from me." That yoke means you're really close. You're right there with Him. "For I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find," not you might find, "you will find rest for your souls. My yoke is easy and my burden is light." Let's stand together in prayer.